I'm going to focus a lot of my attention on the issue of human trafficking and modern slavery as it relates to the impact of climate change. And the reason why I'm going to do a deep dive into this is because, as was indicated, there are a lot of kind of challenges that happen related to this topic based on people not understanding what the issues are. Part of the issue of climate change is it affects the world, and that world affects people, and those people end up being in dysfunctional situations that allow them to be trafficked into modern slavery and human trafficking. And so what I'm going to be doing is just focusing on that and making the case for how actually the private sector is involved in helping to address this particular problem. But to begin with, let me start with kind of some cases. When most people think about human trafficking, they think about the top left-hand photo for good reason. There are 6.3 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was actually 35 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal, and I was a public health officer, and my job was to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive, couldn't understand what was going on. So we went to go and interview the girls and came to realize that many of them had similar stories. And the story went something like this. Human trafficker, guy around 20 years old, would go into a village, flash a bunch of money around and say he's looking for a wife. He'd say, I don't want an urban wife, I want a village wife. He'd find a girl, 12, 13 years old, befriend her, and then go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter, going to take care of us. Everybody's happy. After a couple of days, they actually have a wedding ceremony. After the wedding, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, the capital, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that's not what's going to happen. Instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels are. When she gets there, she's put in a room, and the husband says, I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw all these people milling around. She said, no, don't leave me, I'm scared. He says, it's okay, I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands over the wedding pictures. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in the year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 40 guys a day, every day. You can imagine what this girl's thinking. Oh my gosh, my husband loves me. This isn't true. This can't be happening. The madam says, yes, this is what's going on. When many of these girls internalize what's happening, they say, I will kill myself before I do these shameful things. The madam then brings out the photographs of the wedding and says, here's your mom, your dad, your brother. If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. After that, she's put on the line, and she'll be with dozens and dozens of men every day until after a couple of years, she gets terrible diseases. Nobody wants her anymore, and they throw her out in the street. We've all heard these stories. Once again, 6.3 million women and girls around the world in similar situations. But it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. Top right-hand photo is a fishing boat in Thailand. Story behind this is a 15-year-old boy is told that go on this boat. It'll go out for a couple of months. You'll catch some fish. It'll come back. You'll get lots of money. He gets on the boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 14, 15 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten. Gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. Imagine what that does to his body after 4 years. In order to get him to work, they often give strong stimulants. Those stimulants wreak havoc on his body. If he gets injured, if he gets sick, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, boat comes in, guy goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away. You're legally in my country. Leave me alone. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police. Captain says, go ahead. We own the police. Another example of human trafficking. Bottom center photo. I lived and worked in Thailand for 6 years, working for the United Nations. During the time that I was there, we did a lot of raids and rescues. Story behind this, person from Myanmar hears that there's work in another country. He's avoiding the strife and the violence that's going on in Burma. He goes down to one of these factories, knocks on the door. Factory owner comes out and says, what do you need? Guy says, I'm looking for a job. Factory owner says, okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent to $50 a month. But if you come and work in this factory, you can't leave. This guy's never made more than $25 a month. He's thrilled, goes into the factory, works under terrible conditions. But at least in the back of his mind, he's thinking, I can send this money home. After a couple of months, he goes to the manager and says, I'd like to be paid. Manager says, well, I forgot to mention one thing. By you living in this factory, it cost me the equivalent of 54 US dollars for room and board and everything else. I'm only paying you $50. So guess what? You owe me money. You can't leave this factory until you pay it back. So all of these people have been tricked into this fraudulent situation where every day they work, they get deeper and deeper into debt. Many of them had been working in this factory for years. All their hopes and dreams and aspirations related to their life are lost as a result of this. A terrible life results from this. These are just a couple of examples of what we call modern slavery and human trafficking, where a person loses control of their life and somebody else pretty much owns them. When it comes to the number of people in this situation, it's about 50 million people. If I'd done this presentation 8 months ago, the number would have been 40 million. The reason why it went up significantly is because of COVID. During COVID, you had a lot of people in desperate situations. So let's say that you had a woman in Bangladesh, she was working in a garment factory, COVID hits, all of a sudden what happens? The factory closes, not for a couple of days or weeks or months, but for years. This poor woman basically goes through her savings and eventually has to borrow money, which she can't pay the money back. The money lenders say, well, I need a family member. They're going to go on a fishing boat and a brothel and a sweatshop. And so you see this desperation. But once again, 50 million people in modern slavery. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. I think that's worth repeating. More slaves today than any other time in history. In fact, there are more slaves than Canadians or Australians. We're talking about a lot of people in this particular situation. When it comes to the number of the rate of exploitation that takes place, approximately 9.2 million people enter per year. That translates to 25,200 per day, or 1,000 in the time it takes me to do my session, or a slave every 4 seconds. So if we count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody's being trafficked into human trafficking situation, and the drum beats on and on and on and on. Now, we're talking about climate change, and climate change has all kinds of implications. What used to be normal weather, what used to be normal phenomena in different locations has changed. Where you didn't have floods, you have floods. Where you didn't have fires, you have fires. Where you didn't have drought, you have drought. The ocean is rising. Bangladeshis are being displaced as a result of that. Extreme heat, et cetera, et cetera. As a result of these changes, it has an impact on people and their livelihoods. As a result of drought, people can't grow crops, and so they end up migrating to the cities. They end up kind of changing livelihoods because climate change has an impact on them. I know people who have been displaced because of fires that had to move to completely different locations and start completely over again. This leads to political unrest, desperation, and so forth. So one of the things that fuels modern slavery and human trafficking is the outcome of climate change. And we have to kind of remember that there are all different types of impact, not just on the environment, but on people as well. When it comes to the number of people or the percentage of people who are children related to this issue of human trafficking, it's about a quarter of our children. The rest would be adults. But most people think that human trafficking is predominantly forced prostitution. In reality, it only represents about a quarter of the cases. The other cases we're dealing with are forced labor cases. But this is where it relates to us as human beings. 60% of those forced labor cases are associated with the things that we buy on a regular basis. You know, the phones, the electronics, the clothes, the shoes, the food, the fish, et cetera, et cetera. So as a result of this, we are actually contributing to the problem. So kind of like the climate change industry, when everybody was kind of told that you are contributing to the carbon footprint, that resulted in people stepping up and saying, well, we need to be a part of the solution. As consumers, since we buy things related to products that are tainted by modern slavery, that also demonstrates that we are contributing to the problem. And it begs the question, shouldn't we be part of the solution? I'll come back to that point a little bit later. When it comes to who's supposed to address this issue, well, it's supposed to be governments. But I've worked with over 42 governments around the world, and most governments don't really like this topic. It's embarrassing for the government of Hong Kong or Thailand or New Zealand or any of those governments to have slaves. And many of the governments don't really know what to do with them. So they actually put in place systems and procedures, but not enough to really have much of an impact. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I believe in the United Nations systems, but much of what we did was based on theory and speculation and research, and we never got really close enough to the issue to really make an issue, to make solve the problem. So the non-government organizations or civil society are doing 90% of the work. They're the ones that are going and doing prevention programs and going after the bad guys and taking care of the victims and doing all of the good things that really address the issue. But if we go back to the statistics, 75% of what we're dealing with is forced labor and 60% associated with supply chains. Who else needs to be associated with this? The private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of somebody pointing a finger and saying, it's because of your greed that you would knowingly use human trafficking victims for your shareholder profits and so forth. Now, in reality, I work with a lot of large branded companies, and many of these companies would do anything and everything to avoid exploitation because it has a reputational risk. But most consumers don't feel that that's the case. They think that the private sector is inherently evil and will do these things. I'll come back to that point as well because I think it's an important topic. So what I'm going to show you now is with all of the NGOs and government and United Nations organizations combined, the percentage of people that are actually helped out of modern slavery. And then I'm going to show you out of 500,000 criminals, how many of them actually go to jail each year. So think in your mind with all of these organizations working, what would be a good percentage? And here are the numbers. Last year, out of 50 million people, the world only helped 108,000, which is 0.2% of the victims, not even a 0.5%. When it comes to the 500,000 criminals, about 9,000 criminals were convicted. That's 0.8%. Now, when you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are they lazy? Are they not doing their job? That's not the issue. When it comes to this particular topic, the people who focus on this are some of the most committed people you'll find anywhere in the world. They will do anything and everything in order to address this issue. The problem is this. The profits generated from modern slavery and human trafficking are $236 billion. Now, if I had done this presentation 2 weeks ago, the number would have been 150, but they did a new calculation based on COVID and based on additional identification of indicators that existed. The amount of money that is used globally to fight this issue is about 350 million or 0.1% of the profits. So you have these huge profits that the criminals have in order to address this with a tiny drip, drip, drip of funding available to address this issue. To put the number of funding that is related to this into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, $6 billion worth a year. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating to come up with the equivalent amount of money that is used to fight modern slavery. You can see what it is that we're up against. Another issue is the scale. The number of do-gooder types like me that are around the world that address this issue is about 25,000 people. We work to basically go identify the criminals, to help the victims, to do everything we can to stop this issue. We have to follow rules and regulations. We have to have rule of law. We have to ensure that we are within human rights and so forth. Criminals don't have to do any of those things. As I mentioned, 500,000 criminals around the world. Anyone gets anywhere close to them, what do? They mutate, they evolve, they change. And as a result of that, you have a situation where they have a considerable unfair advantage in doing what they do and preventing them to doing what they're doing. When it comes to awareness, usually when I do a talk like this, if I'm in front of an audience, I ask the audience, how many of you knew even 25% of what I was talking about before I said it? And I usually don't get more than a couple of hands. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. You don't care, you're not going to do anything. It's actually not your fault. We in the counter-trafficking world haven't done a good enough job of raising awareness, which is why we do these talks. And why it's really important to start with an overview of what is human trafficking and modern slavery so that you have a template in your mind so that as additional information comes over time, you can address this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift gears. And I'm going to talk about how the business world has gotten involved in addressing modern slavery. 10 years ago, banks and manufacturers and hotels and retail organizations weren't talking about human trafficking. This was an NGO thing. This was a civil society thing. Why all of a sudden do you have a situation where businesses are asked to step up and get involved in addressing this issue? And a lot of it really comes down to that number of $236 billion generated from modern slavery. And the fact that, much of that is associated with business activities. As I said, 75% is forced labor and 60% is associated with supply chains, which are associated with businesses. So when governments came to realize that the impact being generated from the NGOs and the United Nations was relatively small, less than a percentage, they said, well, we got to bring the banks and we got to bring the manufacturers and the private sector into addressing the problem. But because they felt like the only way they were going to do this was to create some kind of a business risk, many of the trends that we see related to bringing the private sector in focus on creating a sense of vulnerability that draws them in. So the first change that we saw gradually over time was related to legislation. So prior to 2012, there was really no direct relationship for large companies that said you have to address modern slavery. What would happen is the governments and the private sector and the United Nations would periodically meet, debate, discuss, talk about human rights, human trafficking. They'd come up with reports. They would attend conferences and so forth. But the outcome of these events had very little to do with anything legal. The first legislation started in 2012 out of California. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, who was governor at that time, put in place the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act. What this act basically said is that if you are a large company and you have any products in California, you got to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all and you say that, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. A couple of years later, the UK Modern Slavery Act came out and said, if you're a large company working in the UK, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery, but you got to do two additional things. You have to submit an annual report. It's about 20 pages that describes what you're doing to address modern slavery, and that has to be signed by the board of directors. And then you had the French Act and the Australian Act and the German and the Canadian Act. With each of these acts, they add additional points. The Australian Act has an inventory so that consumers can see what companies are doing or not doing. The German Act says that you have to have a grievance mechanism within your supply chain. The Canadian Act goes one step farther and says if you're caught doing modern slavery, you will get fined and penalized. So this legislation is drawing the private sector in the direction of getting involved in addressing modern slavery. We're seeing class action lawsuits against companies. For example, companies in Thailand are being sued because the plaintiffs are saying, if you're a big retail company buying prawns from Thailand, you're supporting modern slavery. And so the plaintiffs are saying you have to use your influence basically to address this issue. Now, most large retailers, let's say in North America, don't have the ability to influence what's happening in Thailand. And most of these cases aren't being won. But what happens is it results in naming and shaming of these companies. Gets into the newspaper, gets into the social media. And as a result of this embarrasses the companies and creates a situation when people don't want to work with them. The chocolate industry is often fraught with issues related to modern slavery. And basically, this comes back to the climate situation as well. Most of the people who end up in the chocolate industry end up there because of droughts or issues related to their own crops. They don't have any choices. And so out of desperations, they end up on these farms, and many of them don't get paid. They just get room and board. They end up working excessive amounts of hours and so forth. But imagine if you're a chocolate company and basically all these stories about forced labor are coming out. So your product, which you want to have associated with Valentine's Day and Easter and all these holidays, gets tainted by modern slavery. Not a good situation. And so these lawsuits create all kinds of issues for major corporations. We're seeing an increase in media attention associated with this, almost a doubling of articles and exposés related to modern slavery every single year. And the relationship between climate change and modern slavery articles has significantly increased in the last 3 years. 3 or 4 times what we've been seeing, because the nexus between these two sectors are beginning to come together. And people are saying, as a result of climate change, here is an impact, and this impact is affecting a lot of people and so forth. ESG, which is basically the metric that is used by corporations to determine whether they're doing right by the environment or governance or the social side, is also a mechanism that's used to kind of incentivize the private sector to get involved in things. So let's say that you're a electric car company, and you're trying to kind of indicate how awesome you are. And so you pick some indicators within the E of ESG that says you're doing right by the environment, or G, which is governance, but you ignore the S. Now, prior to COVID, you could do that. You could pick and choose the various indicators you want. But post-COVID, the assumption is that companies have to have standardized indicators that they used in order to address modern slavery and human trafficking. And so as a result of this, that same electric car company, if they were basically mandated to include where their lithium and cobalt came from, their scores are going to go right down, because cobalt and lithium, as we all know, are mined with forced labor across the Congo and many other locations. And as a result of that, that has a significant impact. So as a result of people, and I'm using a study of millennial investors that identified that 84% of the millennial investors cared about these indicators of ESG, which are related to modern slavery and various other things. This indicates that people care about what's happening. They care about the environment. They care about the social aspect. They care about modern slavery and so forth. And these same investors will also be investing in large mutual funds and revenue generating capitalist type funds and systems and procedures and so forth. And as a result of that transfer, you're going to see more of an emphasis on people addressing the private sector response to modern slavery. So the point of this particular section is to say that in the past, the private sector had no part of this. But as a result of this situation, you are seeing more and more of an emphasis on the private sector feeling like they have to understand the issue and address it within the work that they do. So what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about manufacturing to describe kind of what I mean by this. So prior to the legislation that I mentioned, the major manufacturers around the world, most of them would only be focusing on a small percentage of their supply chain. So what you see here in this visual is a typical supply chain. Let's say it's for a running shoe. Tier one of the supply chain is where you actually assemble the running shoe. The shoelaces and the sole and the cloth all come together. Tier two is where the individual pieces come from, the rivets and the zippers and the sole of shoe. And tier three is the raw material. This is a standard pyramid supply chain. Up until recently, most organizations were only focusing on tier one. They never audited anything below this. But all of a sudden, you have a situation where the legislation says you have to go all the way down to the lowest level of your supply chain. So let's say that you are a shoe company and you are only auditing about 2,000 factories around the world a year. But now you have to look at not only tier one, but tier two and three. That means maybe you have to do 10,000 audits. You can imagine the difficulty that these companies have now, because all of a sudden they have all these audits. And so what you're seeing is this consolidation of information. Companies that never work together are coming together, sharing audit information, saying, we'll do rivets, you do zippers, somebody else do textiles and so forth. And this consolidation results in companies basically kind of looking deeply into their supply chains to see what's happening or not happening. And what they're looking for are indicators of modern slavery. According to the ILO, the International Labor Organization, there are 11 indicators. I'm going to just talk about a few of them to give you a general sense of what some of these issues are. So I'm going to use a story between Nepal and Malaysia. And let's say that you have a person in Nepal. He basically had a farm. As a result of excessive rain from climate change and changes in the environment, there's a lot of landslides. He loses everything. And so he becomes very desperate. A recruitment agent goes into his village and says, hey, how would you like to leave this situation and make a bunch of money working in another country? Guy says, that sounds great. What do I need to do? Well, you need to come with me to Kathmandu, the capital. You need to sign some papers. We'll get you a passport. And we'll send you to Malaysia, and you'll work in a factory and you'll make lots of money. You'll go from making what you would have made, let's say $50 to $250. So he goes, but before he goes and accepts this particular job, the recruitment agency says there's one other things that you need to do. You have to give us $1,500. Now, this guy doesn't have $1,500. He doesn't have any money at all. Recruitment agency says, don't worry about that. we'll get somebody to cover that. You can get a loan and everything else. So he signs a loan, not knowing that by signing that loan, basically it has high interest rates. So by the time he leaves his village and goes to Kathmandu, it's not 1,500 anymore, it's 3,000. By the time he gets to Malaysia, it's 4,500. So he ends up going to Malaysia, but when he gets there, he ends up working for actually months and months and months with nothing going home because he has to pay that loan back. Sometimes up to 2 or 3 years, he ends up just basically working. And as a result of that, he went from being poor to being more poor because no money's going home, the family's borrowing money, et cetera, et cetera. It's called debt bondage. And as a result of this, he basically finds himself in a situation where he was less well off than he was before. Another thing that happens prior to leaving Nepal, he signs a contract. When he gets to Malaysia, they give him another contract. He looks at it and he says, well, I don't know what it says. It's in a language I don't know. The guy says, you got to sign it. He says, if you don't sign it, you're going to lose everything. We're going to send you back. You're going to lose, and you're going to find yourself in a much more dire situation. So he signs the contract, not knowing what it says. But as a result of that, he ends up finding himself in a situation where they further cheat him. There's additional fees and penalties that are associated with this. And so he's not really making $250. He's only making $125. And that money is used in order to pay his debt. Another thing that happens when he gets to Malaysia is they take his documentation. They say they need it for the visa. After a couple of years, he says, listen, I've had enough. I'm going to go home. Give me my passport. Factory says, no. Says, give me my passport. No. He says, I'll go and tell the police. Factory says, go ahead. Who do you think they're going to believe? We'll say we don't have it. They're going to see you don't have your passport. They're going to see you're a migrant in a foreign country. They're going to put you in a remand center. They're going to put you in jail. You lose everything. So basically having documentation holds people in place. These are just a few of the indicators of what we're talking about here. So as a result of that, what you're seeing is that major companies around the world are significantly changing in order to ensure that they are addressing the needs of workers. This includes extensive training that's being provided, not only to the brand, but to the suppliers and the sub-suppliers and the factories and so forth. And I know this because I provide a lot of this training. You're seeing that factories or brands are going to factories and saying to them, do you have any indebted employees there? If the factory says yes, the brand will say, we can't work with you. That indebtedness has to be paid off before we'll work with you. And that ensures that these individuals, these workers who come from one country to another, don't find themselves in a debt bonded situation. There's grievance mechanisms that are put in place that allow for workers basically to kind of describe what their situation is to an NGO, an independent third-party organization, to ensure that there are no issues of modern slavery. And lastly, kind of audits are getting much deeper into going to the workers, asking questions, making sure that there are no issues. So as a result of this, you see that the private sector has significantly changed in addressing the needs of workers in these situations. Now, I come back to the climate change situation because many of the people that we're dealing with, the 50 million people that end up in this situation, end up there because of situations around the world that displace them from their land or create scenarios where a disaster basically ruins the employment situation that they have. And so this direct nexus is there and has to be taken into consideration. Now, I'm the CEO of an organization called the Mekong Club. We are based in Hong Kong. We work with banks, manufacturers, retailers, the hospitality sector, and we work with companies to help them to understand the issue of modern slavery and how it works and how it can affect their business and how climate change can be a contributing factor associated with this. One of the things that we do is we do a baseline in order to kind of get a general sense of where a company is in their kind of a process of identifying modern slavery. Out of 100 points, when we do these surveys, many of them get somewhere around 30 or 40. And it's because they don't understand that leadership needs to understand about the topic. You need codes of conducts and policies and trainings and risk assessments and various other things. And once we identify what these gaps are, we work with companies in order to help them to address it. We also have about 35 different tools that we offer to this community to help address every aspect of human trafficking. These could be dashboards, it could be apps, it could be learning materials, it could be trainings, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of this, we are able to really have an impact in helping these organizations to do the right thing. With that, I'm going to end. I'll stop sharing, and I'll continue the discussion from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was so clear and really needed to hear by all, I imagine, and it reminded me of so many things, current in my life that I need to make sure is aligned in all of the things that we use and buy, and they're made all over the world. And so we're all part of this. So it's so important. And I want to invite any questions for Matthew and any comments about the subject by the group. We have about 15 minutes, just so you know, we have about 15 minutes for more Q&A style, and then another 15 for discussion.
Thanks so much for this, Matthew. I've heard you speak before, and I learn more every time. And thank you for bringing awareness to this and for your continued work in this area. One question that came to mind when you talked about factories being visited and asking the factory owner, do you have any indebted workers here? What keeps them from lying? Is there a team that investigates as well?
A lot of organizations do lie. Now, let's put into perspective this whole issue of migrants going from one country to another. And I'll use India as an example. It's quite common for Indian families to pool their money to be able to send one of their family members, let's say, to the Middle East or to Malaysia or some other location. This system and procedure has been in place for many, many, many years. And as a result of it, there's this expectation. And so as part of this new ILO responsible recruitment kind of expectation is that you can no longer have employees working in factories that have paid for their job. And so it's up to the factory itself to repay these amounts. So let's say that you're a Malaysian factory and you've been having people being sent from India on a regular basis, and you just accept these people, and the payment is between the employee and the recruitment company, and all of a sudden, the factory is told that, well, that factory worker that you have paid $2,000. You have to pay that money back. Oh, by the way, you have 500 employees times, $2,000. So obviously these factories are in a situation where, like, well, what are we going to do? That's a tremendous amount of money. We're trying to make ends meet and so forth. And so it's really kind of a difficult situation for a lot of these factories. And so what they often do is say to the employees, if anyone asks you whether or not you paid for your job, tell them that you haven't. And so auditors go in and they're looking for those employees that eventually say that they paid for it. And all of a sudden it becomes a big audit issue for the brands. And so then there's tension between the factory and the brand, and a lot of negotiation back and forth and so forth. And the reason for that is the recruitment agencies have had this kind of cash cow of being able to generate all this money. They've been cheating migrants for years. It doesn't cost nearly $2,000 to send people and train them and so forth, but they've been receiving this money. And so we're in this transition where it's very awkward. Recruitment companies are saying, well, we want people to pay. And, the factories are saying, we don't have the money for this. And the brands are saying, well, we can't work with you and you do this. And so it's a very difficult scenario that's unfolding right now, because I know one toy company that basically can't find any factories to work with because all of the factories have people who have been paid. And the factories are saying, well, we're not going to pay these back. You want us basically to spend $500,000 US so that I can have a contract with you for 300,000, nothing doing. So these are the complexities that you find sometimes when it comes to addressing employment issues related to the topic of modern slavery.
Thank you. We have JB has his hand raised for her.
Hi, my name's Jessica. I just wanted to say I'm driving at the moment, but I wanted to say thank you very much, Matthew, for speaking on these very important worldly issues. And there's been a lot of insight provided from what you spoke on today. With that being said, what came to mind and heart as I was listening to you was that there's a lot of different socioeconomic issues in the world at large, economically speaking. So one of the queries that we were running in our minds listening to you was, how do we solve this issue in the most efficient way possible as consumers? Considering the socioeconomic strata of poverty and wealth. And so I wanted to ask you if you have any ideas on a basic structure or strata of how individuals can be empowered at all levels of the socioeconomic strata to essentially overcome this issue.
That's a very good question. It's a question that I could go on for a couple of hours, but I'm just going to give you kind of an example of choices that organizations can make. In the United States, in Detroit, about 30 years ago, there was a question of, do you maintain a workforce of 500,000 workers to build cars, or do you use robots? And they chose to use robots. And as a result of that, you had 500,000 people who no longer had jobs. And maybe the robots are more efficient in some ways and they cut costs and so forth. But by making those choices, you have 500,000 people who don't have jobs. And so as a world, there's a point at which we have to start asking the question of, you can do something more efficiently in a particular way, but if that displaces 100 people or 500 people or 1,000 people, is it morally and ethically right to do something like that? Recognizing that there are all these people around the world, many of them who are disenfranchised, don't have jobs, don't have opportunities. Shouldn't we be thinking more in terms of kind of a holistic, sustainable society that allows for everybody to have a piece of the pie? And so that kind of thinking is often missing. And actually, in addressing the topic that we're talking about, climate change, we have to have the same type of questions. We have to ask ourselves, is fossil fuel, for example, it's convenient, it's easy. Is that the way to go? Or should we be thinking about alternative sources? These questions are kind of missing because we don't have forums like this that allow us as a community to debate and discuss and talk about these things. The question that you ask is fundamental, and a lot of people have it, but the solutions that are require us as a community to dive into it, to jump into it, to talk about it, and to answer these questions. So many of the people that I have met who are victims of human trafficking are victims because nobody really cares about them, in their constituency. The Rohingya, for example, that are displaced in many parts of Southeast Asia, nobody cares about them. And we as a world have to start kind of accepting responsibility for taking care of everybody. And if we were to move more in that direction, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now related to climate change or modern slavery or many of the other things that you're talking about, including poverty. 1% of the world owns half of the resources in the world. I mean, I can't get my head around that. Why does a person have to have $100 billion? Imagine if that was diversified and shared and used for organizations like this in order to really step up and make a difference. We'd have a much different world, a much more equitable world, a much fairer world. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with these types of forums, is to get into these types of discussions and to talk about these things.
Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you. We have a question in the chat that says, what can we do to make sure our governments are introducing modern slavery bills which cover any employers in the country, not just larger corporations?
I think it's a matter of just starting to write letters. Let me give you an example. It's not about governments, but it indicates the impact of consumers kind of being interested in a particular topic. A couple of years ago, I was in the United States. I did a presentation, and I had a bunch of students come up to me, about 10 of them, and they said, well, we really want to make a difference. What can we do? We want to see whether or not we can address consumer behavior. And so I said, is there a retail store in town? And they said, yeah, there's a big one. And I said, okay, well, once a day, each of you, so each person does each day, you go in there, you find the manager and you say, well, how do you know that all these products here aren't tainted by modern slavery? And so on the first day, the student went in there and asked the manager. Manager said, I don't know. Second day, person went in there, asked the manager. Manager said, I don't know. What are you guys doing? And then explained it. Third day, I don't know. Fourth day, he had a piece of paper in his hand from the corporation headquarters. Fifth day, he knew what the paper said. Sixth day, it was on the cash register. Seventh day, cash register person knew about it. Eighth day, it was on the bulletin board. The point is that if consumers or the constituents within a community start kind of asking questions and kind of encouraging that something takes place, even if it's not in large numbers, that has an impact. I know, for example, in New Zealand, about 20 letters were sent to the New Zealand government basically saying we need a transparency legislation law, and that was enough to get the ball rolling. So the power of recognizing that you have a voice, and that voice can be exercised by simply going to the government and saying, we feel like something should change, significantly does make a difference. And that's what I would suggest as a beginning point.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. There's another question. What steps can businesses and industries make to ensure that their supply chains are free from human trafficking and modern slavery?
That's a great question. And I'll just give a bunch of different factors. Some people feel like the only thing they have to do are audits, but the first thing is make sure that your leadership, that includes your C-suite and your board, knows about the issue. The second is to have a point person or a committee or a group within the organization that will address this topic. The third one is to have policies and procedures that state your intent, that you want to be have a zero tolerance related to human trafficking, and that you're going to look at your business and address it. Another thing is to provide training to your staff so that everybody understands what it is that we're talking about when we have this conversation, and then have risk assessments. Look at your supply chain, identify the segments of your supply chain that might be in vulnerable areas. And then when it comes to audits, do a deep dive, really go into it, not only in the top of your supply chain, but all the way down to the lowest levels. And when you find things, be aggressive at remediating it and changing it, and put in place grievance mechanisms so that employees have an opportunity. If you put those things in place, you're going to be able to protect a business. And so let's say that you're a manufacturing company and you have 350,000 employees through your supply chain and suppliers and everything else. By you setting up a system, you've addressed 350,000 people in this system. So sometimes people say, well, we should go to the governments and work on this. If you're talking about corporations with this many employees, if they get it right and you get 1,000 organizations that have 350,000 people that they're addressing, making sure that there's no exploitation, you're talking about a lot of people doing this. And the reason why it's important to work with the private sector is because they are incentivized to make a change, because if word gets out that they're exploiting people, it has a devastating impact on their business. For example, there was a fast fashion brand in the UK. It was identified as having modern slavery. It resulted in a 2 billion sterling pound loss of revenue as a result of this. Companies recognized that they can't be in that situation, so they were motivated to do things. Governments, not so much, but corporations are, because they have to be concerned about their bottom line. And if naming and shaming is going to happen as a result of this, they're going to do everything they can to fix things so that that doesn't happen.
I'm an international student studying in Australia. I'm from India, having witnessed modern slavery firsthand in India. Do you guys think that the main core of the problem comes from the lack of education from the business owners' end? Because the people, having witnessed that firsthand, I believe the people employing those modern slaves are essentially uneducated about the concepts themselves. And counting that, I think those would be really less number of people and would be easily to be educated rather than targeting million people.
Well, education obviously is something that is super relevant and important. As was indicated at the beginning of this conference, girls' education is often neglected. Education offers opportunities for better jobs and so forth. But there's another part of education is understanding the issue of human trafficking as it relates to your community. Most victims of human trafficking around the world don't realize that they're victims of anything. They feel like, well, it's just my bad luck. I found myself in this situation. I got indebted. I made the wrong choices. I shouldn't have taken this job. They don't realize that there are laws that protect them. And so if you don't know about human trafficking, if you don't know how to protect yourself, then you are basically vulnerable to find yourself in one of these situations. I did a lot of work in India, about 6 months. I lived in Bangladesh for 5 years. I lived in Nepal for 8 years. And so I know that part of the world. And how we used to educate people were with soap operas. We would develop a 10-hour series that would have, drama where you would have like the family that was successful and the family that weren't successful going through the motions, and you'd see this. And so it was almost like watching a soap opera on television. You had individuals that were, making choices, and you were seeing the outcomes of this and so forth. And what would happen is the DVD would be circulated all over. People in small villages would use it, watch it over and over again. The TV and radio stations would use the information and the content. And the reason why it was important to do this is because in Asia, most migrants that get exploited and come back lie about their experience. And the reason why they do that is they're afraid to lose face. So you have all these migrants that are exploited. When they come back, they say, well, I made a bunch of money, but I lost it because I got robbed or whatever, but it's really good over there. Because they don't want people to realize that they failed at that particular job. And so unless you can demonstrate through the dramas and so forth what actually happens, people don't know it's happening. And so that's one of the constraints and the issues that we often face in this part of the world where I've spent much of my career.
Thanks, Matt. That was a really good insight. I was just properly concentrating about the factory workers, because essentially when I tried to drill into it in 2016 and 2018, I found out that most of the factory workers was just following people who were giving them employment, and the people employing them did not also know that they were promoting modern slavery. In their head, they were trying to help the people getting employment and food and all of those kind of stuff.
Yeah, I do presentations all over the world to all different private sector companies at all different levels. And whether you're a large brand or you're a factory or a sub factory or whatever, I find that very few of these private sector organizations recognize that by doing the things that they do, they often exploit people, and the exploitation would be sufficient to be called modern slavery or human trafficking. So much of what has to happen is that we have to get that information out to various groups, and we have to do it in such a way that they come to recognize that what they're doing is inappropriate, and it's not acceptable within the world anymore, and it has to change. And I'll just say one thing. I was in Malaysia, and I was in a factory, and I walked into the office of the manager, and I looked at the desk, and I said, well, you have all those passports there. These are from the migrants. You can't have them. These people have to have them. And he said, well, if I give it back, they'll all run away. And I said, well, that's exactly the reason why you can't have them. And then I said to him, well, when you go onto the factory floor, if somebody's not working hard enough, you can't hit them on the top of the head and say, work harder. That's physical abuse. And so this guy looked at me and said, well, come on. In the East, here in Asia, we do things differently. That's just kind of the way you do. You Western people, you're trying to impose something on us. And so I had to sit this guy down and said, this isn't an East-West thing. This is a global kind of accepted set of principles that everyone around the world is using. And if you don't change, you're not going to have a business very soon, because the expectation is that you have to follow these rules, these regulations. You have to protect your employees and so forth. This was a big shock to him. He was like, you mean the companies that are auditing really care about these things? Yeah. And it was one of those moments in time when you basically had an individual it had that aha moment, like, oh, now I get it. Now I recognize. And within the environmental movement, you have similar types of things where you explain something and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, now I get it. Those aha moments are really essential, but it only happens with good education and targeting people who need to understand something that they don't understand.
Yeah. Sounds like needs to be addressed from many, many levels and layers. There was a comment in the chat about, have billionaires been informed about all that you've shared? So another way is like, getting the information through to everyone. Is that something you do, or is that? Yeah.
I've worked with, I think 6 billionaires now. And the interesting thing about many of the billionaires that I've worked with is that they indicate that they want to do something, but they can't seem to get their head around what it is that they feel like they need to do. And it's partly, I need more information. And so with the exception of one out of Australia, most of them haven't really stepped up. In fact, out of Australia, there was one billionaire who said he was going to contribute $1 billion to address modern slavery. And eventually he went on and spent a lot of money and did a lot of good things and so forth. But if you stop and think about the fact that we are basically addressing a $236 billion annual revenue from the profits of modern slavery business with 350 million US dollars, which is 0.1%. We're going to need some billionaires to step up, or some governments or something to step up. And let me just give you an example of in the United States, the U.S. government spends about $26 billion in HIV/AIDS around the world. It's a very laudable thing, and a lot of people benefit, and that's great. They spend about $31 billion on addressing the war against drugs. But the U.S. government only spends about $176 million on addressing human trafficking. So if they were to kind of step up and treat this the way it should be treated, as a global issue that needs to be addressed because lots of people are disenfranchised and so forth, then, we would be in a much better situation. And I go back to just sex trafficking. As I indicated, 6.3 million women and girls forced to have sex with anywhere from 5 to 20 or more guys every day. That's commercial rape. The fact that we're not, as a world, stepping up to eliminate this from happening, I just don't understand it. I can't get my head around it. I don't know why. If I was a billionaire, I would certainly want to spend money on something like that. I can't get my head around why more and more money isn't being spent on this.
Absolutely. We need to reprioritize our goals. And there's 2 more questions, and then we'll probably we'll transition to the next speaker. What is the youngest and oldest age of victims of human trafficking and modern slavery, as far as per your research and actions?
I've seen infants as young as 2 years old that have been sold to pedophiles through trafficking scenarios. In my particular case, how I became an activist was I was invited by the Indian government to go into the brothels and do public health checks. And I had an 11-year-old girl run up to me and wrap herself around me and said, save me, they're doing terrible things to me. I happen to have a police officer with me. And I turned to him and said, we need to get this girl out of here. He said, we can't do that. I said, what are you talking about? You're a cop. He says, if we try to leave, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. And for a lot of us who get into this activism, we have an experience like that, after that, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I was so traumatized by it that I surrendered to the fact that this is what I'm going to do with my life. And so a lot of people get into it that way. So the age, certainly in this particular case, had an impact on me. The oldest, I've seen 85-year-old people basically in South Asia, being forced to break bricks into smaller pieces for construction sites, and so they'll work from 6 a.m. until sometimes 9 o'clock at night every day. And here, these are people who should be retired. They shouldn't be doing this kind of work. And so every age in between, obviously. And so somewhere between the ages of 14 and 30 is where you see the bell-shaped curve where most of the people are victims of human trafficking.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really important. One more question is, how can we work with clubs in Kenya to curb trafficking of youth in sex industry and cheap labor?
One of the biggest reasons why people end up in the sex industry is they get tricked and deceived with a job offer or a modeling offer or, a false marriage or whatever. So starting, from, let's say, the 8th or 9th grade, talking about, the fact that people will trick you and deceive you, the fact that people will offer you something. These days, for example, in China, one of the biggest ways that people are being recruited into the sex industry is through chat rooms. And so you have a 55-year-old Chinese man who's posing as a 17-year-old boy on a youth chat site, basically, identifying vulnerable girls, and then eventually, getting that girl to meet him, and then you have a 17-year-old who is actually part of the trafficking network who will meet with this girl. They'll have what's called a date when it really isn't, because he takes her to a restaurant, he drugs the drink, and then she ends up in a hotel room naked with all kinds of compromised pictures. And then he basically says, you either become a prostitute and work in this brothel, or we're going to send this to your family and everybody else. And because of the shame associated with this, they comply. So education is essential, whether it's in Kenya or in China, to just help people to understand that if you don't know a person and they offer you something that seems too good to be true, it probably isn't, and you should be concerned about it.